All right, everybody, we are currently recording, so just so you know, that's happening. Okay, welcome and good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us here virtually on the web for the Climate Adaptation Plan workshop number 2. This is going to be a jam-packed hour of fun and information for all of you on what has been going on with the Climate Adaptation Plan and all of the technical information we have been doing. I'm going to first start us off with a quick overview of our Zoom. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have done this so far, but we are going to have people mute themselves throughout. Obviously, we do want to have this as really interactive as possible, so you can unmute yourself when you have comments. We are going to ask you to, under your participant item on your screen, you will have a little thing that comes up and you can raise your hand and we will make sure to call on you. During the comment, that we'll have pauses throughout the presentation and we'll just ask for some questions. We're also going to be using the chat function so that if you want to go ahead and type comments as we're going, Leslie Reagan is kindly watching that. And so if there's a clarification question, you know, someone's talked too fast, or you don't get what they're saying, we'll pause a moment and let you answer that. We're also going to be capturing all those chat comments. So if there's something that comes to you, you just want to say that comment now, go ahead and put it in the chat and we will capture that without any questions. So hopefully that will be all clear. We're also going to be using polls today. So hopefully the polling will work. There are some weird elements. It seems like some people have a little bit harder time finding it. Hopefully it will pop up without a problem for each of you. So I'm just going to jump in here and talk about what we're going to go over today. So we're going over our introductions right now, and I'm going to introduce our team in just a second. But we'll have an overview of the planning process and the scope and where we are right now. And then we're going to dig into the hillside and wildfire strategies and some of the solutions and options that have been identified. And then we're going to have a longer period to go into the shoreline and sea level rise strategies. Get to some of the details about what that looks like. We'll wrap up and make sure to finish up at 6:30, but we will be able to stay a little longer if people have burning questions that they want to talk about. And I just want to note that we have what's called a story map that we'll be launching tonight, which will have this information, but a lot more that you can interact with. You can pause over it, get some of those details, spend a lot of time with it, share it with your friends, family, and there's a survey as well as part of that. So you'll be able to get more information and provide ongoing feedback. And we're going to leave that open and available and capture that on July 17th. Of course, you'll be able to continue to access those materials as we go on. But let me just take a moment here and have our team introduce themselves. Let me go ahead with Sasha. Why don't you introduce yourself and then we'll go from there.
Hey everybody, I really appreciate you taking the time out to join this virtual workshop. I know it's busy weeks all the time, so we really appreciate you being here and your input. My name is Sasha Peterson. I'm with Adaptation International.
All right, Chris, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, Chris Fornash with Nelson Nygaard Consulting Associates. I'm a principal with the firm and we are the transportation lead for the adaptation work, part of the consulting team. Thank you.
And Chris, do we have other people from Nelson Nygaard on that should introduce themselves?
My colleague Emily Roach is on the call, but I'm not sure if she is, well, I know she's joining, but I'm not sure if she's on yet. So okay. You may hear her later. Okay,
great. And then let's go to SFEI. Let's go with Jeremy. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jeremy Lowe with SFEI, San Francisco Ice Institute. I'm a senior scientist there, and we've been working on the sea level rise and shoreline pieces. And also with us tonight is Ellen Plain, who's done a lot of the scientific work, but is also taking notes, I think, tonight as well.
Awesome, that's wonderful. All right, Leslie, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Leslie Reagan. I'm working with the town of Corte Madera and the Public Works Department.
Great. And then RJ, do you want to introduce you and the team from the town?
Sure. RJ Succo, Director of Public Works. We'll also have Adam Wolf, Planning Director here if he's not already, to field any questions. We're definitely excited about tonight. We feel like we've got a lot of new material to really present and get a lot of good feedback, so can't wait.
Thanks, Rajay. And there are a number of other people who are on the team who are contributing to this, but just in the matter of time, we'll stop there. And I will also introduce myself. I'm Mindy Craig with Blue Point Planning and helping out the team on facilitation, outreach, and elements of the project.
And actually, if I may, yes, and we also have council member David Kuhnhart on the line.
Great.
And then I believe Eli Beckman and Charles Lee both as well. Eli's our mayor and Charles Lee is our council member as well. Gentlemen, would you like to say any words?
Nope. Yeah, no.
All right. And we are, just as a recap, we are recording this evening. So people who are not able to join us right now will be able to watch it at a later date. So just know that. Okay, so we're going to do a quick little thing. Get yourself ready to use Zoom. We're just quickly, tell us, where do you live in Corte Madera, if you do live there? All right, I have almost all of you guys have voted. I'm going to give one more second here. All right, we have a pretty good mix, but most of you are near the floodplain. So we have 8 of you near the floodplain and about 6 in the wildfire, several people who don't live in Corte Madera but work there. And then, of course, I'm sure there's some of our team members who do not live in the town. I want to ask you one other question, which is less lighthearted, but is more about what are some of the biggest concerns that you are thinking about as we look forward. You can pick up multiples of these, but what is on your mind here? I mean, there's so much going on right now in society, and we thought this was the biggest thing, and now it's a lot more going on. So let us know what that is. Give people about a few more minutes. We have almost everybody on. And if you feel like you want to add something else to this, you can for sure add it into the comments. So if there's more ideas or thoughts that you have on the chat screen, feel free to add that there. Sometimes there's a little bit more detail than we can have in a multiple choice. Okay, so I'm going to end this poll and I'm going to share the results here. So we're still very much aligned on, our concerns are these long-term issues of wildfires and flooding. Obviously, COVID-19 has taken a new role in our mind, as has the ongoing awesome concept of climate change. But insurance coverage, which is clearly part and parcel of that, is also up there. And then we have the added economic uncertainty and earthquakes, which they're still there. Sasha, did you want to add anything to that, or any thoughts?
No, this is great. It's great to see those reflected, and those are the 2 key things that we're going to be talking about: adaptation options and solutions, and getting your inputs for. So it's great to see those reflected.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, so let's see. Let's move on, and I am going to turn this over to RJ, who's going to start talking about the adaptation plan and process and scope. RJ, you're
great.
up.
Well, good evening. Once again, yeah, I'm excited to present this new material and get a lot of good feedback. Just want to kind of touch on the overall process. This was a grant that was received through CalTrans and through the Senate Bill 1 program. We've been working on it for a little over a year now, and we're hoping to complete the assignment either toward the end of the year or early part of 2021. This is probably one of the more eventful workshops in that we're kind of turning the corner. Next slide, please. Here we have the sequencing and the phasing, and we're right there at turning the corner between exploring adaptation options, and then as we get your feedback, we'll be moving into our refining adaptation options. And so as mentioned prior by Mindy, we've got tons of material to discuss. We're going to probably move forward probably quicker than everyone can actually absorb the material, but I want to reassure you, we're going to have plenty of opportunity to provide feedback for several weeks after the meeting. We're recording it. We'll have some additional polls. The idea is to really kind of take it home, think about it, talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, talk to anyone who's interested, and then provide additional feedback. And also on that July 17th date, it doesn't mean that that's the last time to provide feedback. It just means if you want to kind of keep with the flow of the overall process, then that's going to be most helpful for us to get your feedback by then. Yeah, in the previous slide, we've had several public engagement opportunities. There was 2 community workshops held back in spring of, I believe it was 2019. We've been to the Flood Control Board. We've touched on some of the concepts with council through the strategic planning workshop and others. And we've met with the Rural Resilience Advisory Committee several times, which is consisting of folks either in the industry or in the government, kind of pushing the same types of strategies along. And so we've collected their feedback. We've also met with them, various resource agencies one-on-one to really kind of understanding any of the permitting challenges or preferences they might want to see in our strategies as we start to develop them. And that just further streamlines our ability to have something that's actually closer to what could be built, and just kind of keeps our direction more on the path that we want. So next slide, please. So you may have seen this. So this is a map showing Town of Corte Madera and the adjacent agencies. We've kind of broken it up into some specific zones here for study areas. And not that we aren't looking at everything, but we do think these kind of represent the larger concepts that we're trying to plan ahead for. And so you've got the fire zones with Christmas Tree Hill, Chapman Hill, Granada Park. They all have their challenges. And you're going to see this map numerous times. And so I'm going to just introduce it now, and we'll dive into each one in more detail. We have Lucky Drive and Paradise Drive, which are somewhat unique because they present some what I'm calling near-term opportunities. If that's, if we can identify funding or compete for funding, they kind of fit this regional benefit opportunity that we'll get into. And then also you have all these marsh strategies and alternatives that are highly important, but likely would take more time to prepare and develop given the environmental compliance and regulatory issues that go along with them. Next slide, please. So lastly, you'll notice the big yellow blob, and that is representative of kind of the heart of our flood control network. In there we have, most of our storm drain pipes feed into that. There's several detention basins. There's numerous pump stations. I believe we have 11 pump stations in total across town. We've got, believe it or not, 43 miles of storm drain system. We've got 1,100 feet of levee. And so that, what we're suggesting and recommending is that we study the overall flood control network, all of those pieces I just mentioned, as part of a separate study that we're calling a storm drain master plan, and then also allow it to fold in some of the projections for sea level rise and more intense rainfall. So it's a big enough effort that it deserves to be standalone. And so we're kind of going to leave that as an option, but not dive into it per se as part of this climate adaptation plan. Next slide, please.
All right.
And yeah, go ahead, sorry. And I was going to turn it over to Mindy to talk about value-driven science-based stuff.
It's always tough when you can't see everybody's face. Sasha, Sasha, why don't you take it away?
Totally. Before we dive into those options and those focus areas in more detail that RJ was suggesting, just want to take a step back and kind of lay out the overall framework for the plan so we have all of that in mind. And really, it's driven by these 2 principles, that it's values driven, so the desires, the wants, the community values, as well as being in space. So we're bringing in the best available science, and it's weaving components together that will hopefully ensure that the adaptation plan is both useful and usable by the town at the end of this project. And all of you are a key component to making that true by adding your comments, thoughts, suggestions, and refinements as we go through the process. Next slide. We all know that climate change is a clear and present danger for the community, for the region, for the county, for the state. So just to have this graphic, we're not going to go into detail on all those climate projections over the course of this, presentation or this webinar and discussion, but just to have them top of mind. If you start on the right-hand side, obviously sea levels are rising and creating coastal flooding challenges for some of our shoreline neighborhoods. Sea levels are projected to continue to rise for the coming centuries, so those challenges aren't going away. Extreme precipitation events are likely to increase as a warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture, and we'll have more atmospheric rivers, so creating more inland flooding challenges. Temperatures are, of course, rising, and it's not just the increase in average annual temperature that's going to be an issue, but how it changes the extremes and having more extreme heat events that could affect particularly residents that have underlying health conditions or older adults or children more susceptible to those extreme heat events. Obviously, wildfire, we saw that in the poll at the beginning, is a known concern for the county and for the town, and that's not going away. As temperatures warm, wildfires are likely to, the risk of wildfires is likely to increase, and there are projections that show the extent of the area burned in Northern California increasing. And then finally, drought is also a concern. As the state went through a drought a few years ago, drought conditions are likely to reoccur. We're going to have more extreme precipitation events and more periods without precipitation. And even if precipitation was to remain constant or relatively constant, higher temperatures mean more evaporation, more evapotranspiration, and less water availability. So those are all of the many issues that the town is looking to be better prepared for through the development of the adaptation plan. Next slide. So in that first couple phases of the project that RJ showed with the community workshops and the meetings with the town council and the resilience advisory committee, the project crafted a vision. So at the culmination of developing this plan and implementing the resilience actions, the overall vision is to build a town that is one town, one region, resilient together. So it highlights that the town can take a leadership role in building climate resilience, but many of these challenges go beyond the town boundaries and will take those multi-jurisdictional collaborations to be effective in building resilience. In support of that vision, this project has 5 key goals, and the implementation of the plan should hopefully achieve these goals. The first goal is, you can read there, but I'll just highlight briefly, is to protect the health, safety, and well-being of all the town's residents, visitors, and workers, and importantly, by focusing on preparedness and prevention. So it's sort of shifting into a really proactive approach to looking to the future and developing options that address the concerns, not only of today, but also of tomorrow, and not waiting for a disaster to happen in order to enhance preparedness. The second goal is incorporating resilience and equity into the town's plans, policies, and projects so that the town begins to mainstream actions to build resilience into ongoing efforts. So it's not a standalone effort, but something that can inform ongoing efforts throughout the community. Goal 3 is prioritizing feasible, cost-effective, nature-based actions that provide multiple benefits. So it's not just preparing for a single extreme weather event, but it's designing investments into the community that can be used on a day-to-day basis, enhance the quality of life, and meet those other needs for the community as well. And then finally, the last 2 goals are increasing community awareness about the urgency to take action, prepare for climate change, and also bringing the community, town, and the region together to both plan, but also fund some of these efforts. I'm not going to take a long time to pause, but if you have comments or thoughts on these, please feel free to put them into the chat. And then also, as part of that story map that Mindy mentioned, there are specific questions about these goals that you can provide more detailed comments there. Next slide. The nice thing about that vision and goal structure is it really creates a solid foundation for the discussion we're going to have today. The community vision and values is shown there at the bottom. So that's the base, that's the foundation. The goals build on top of that. And then now in the project, we're moving, as RJ said, pivoting into the second half where we're looking at the alternatives that are on the table, the different options that could be affected for the community, and developing priority actions and projects based on those suite of alternatives. So over the course of today and then through that ongoing engagement over the next 4 weeks or a few months, we would love to gather your input on which of these actions and alternatives are likely to be most effective, which ones you support, which ones match your values, and also rise to the challenge of preparing for a changing climate. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who's going to talk more specifically about the hillside challenges and some of the suite of alternatives and strategies that are being evaluated as part of this plan.
Thanks, Sasha. So far, we've talked mostly about the project in general and about the approach to looking at climate risks that are being brought to bear in the town. Here we shift, as the map that RJ showed earlier, to speak specifically about the hillside neighborhoods, next slide please, and about the climate vulnerabilities that are most focused on those neighborhoods. This is a map prepared by CAL FIRE that shows wildfire hazard designations, the darkest red being the very high risk severity zone. It's off to the up the hillside from Corte Madera town limits, but you see significant parts of Christmas Tree Hill, Chapman Hill, and other hillside neighborhoods are in the high fire severity risk zone. Narrower bands further downhill in the medium zone, and then the lowest lying parts of the town are not rated for fire risk. That said, wildfire as a particular vulnerability can still bring impacts to the rest of the town, including smoke, including the impacts of people evacuating hillside neighborhoods. I don't need to explain that to those of you who live in Corte Madera. But a useful thing to note here is that substantial portions of the hillsides are at least in the high fire severity risk zone. Next slide, please. And also recognize that while we're shorthanding the discussion as talking about wildfire risk as the most top of mind risk, climate vulnerability, if you will, in the hillside neighborhoods, some of those other things that Sasha described, including severe rainfall events that might cause slides or other events on the hillsides, those are relevant to this discussion as well. So within that context of the hillside neighborhoods, there are 3 discrete areas that we're looking at how to bring the adaptation strategies and actions in our toolbox, how to essentially deploy those tools to come up with policy and infrastructure changes to suggest in those neighborhoods that can help to build resilience to major events, but also, as Sasha noted, to provide benefits to the community on an ongoing day-to-day basis. And we at Nelson Nygaard, we're a people-first transportation planning firm, so all of our lens on whether it's through climate resilience or other work is about multimodal transportation and how can that provide ongoing benefits to people's lives. Next slide, please. So this is a tighter focus on the same information you saw 2 slides ago. Here, Christmas Tree Hill to the center of the screen and Chapman Hill neighborhood to the right of the screen, showing further where you can actually see the individual homes within the neighborhoods that are categorized as high fire severity risk zone. You can also begin to see the contours of the street networks. Those of you who live in the neighborhoods certainly understand, and I'll generally characterize both neighborhoods, but especially Christmas Tree Hill, as the further you get up the hill, the more winding the streets are, the more narrow the streets are, the more you're confined to one way or maybe 2 ways in or out from a particular home, and that's a vulnerability that we're trying to address through our work here. Next slide, please. So among the potential transportation-focused actions that can increase resilience and adaptability of the hillside neighborhoods are a suite of policy change tools, such as improving parking management, especially parking on streets. Trust me, I know that anytime you say the word parking, you are gearing up for a fight. But you know, especially those of you who live in the neighborhoods, that the narrowest parts of the streets can be further reduced in their effective width by the presence of parked cars on those streets. And especially at times of crisis or times of major events, that inability to move both down the hill if you're trying to get out, or up the hill if other routes are better, and to have emergency vehicles gain access is critical in response. So providing policy, thinking through policy changes such as changes to parking management, and also it can be a challenge to think about other modes of access and egress when you're talking, especially in a wildfire frame of mind. But bikes, especially e-bikes, can be a part of the tool set, and other communities in California are exploring the ways not just to improve the infrastructure, but to provide people or communities incentives to buy e-bikes to use for both, again, the special event of needing egress from a neighborhood under threat, but also the day-to-day transportation needs of residents. And if you haven't been following along, as we've all dealt with the implications of COVID, the bike purchase market is taking off in a major way, but the e-bike market is exploding to the point where right now it's very hard to even find one. But that's a mode of transportation that we're seeing more and more. Moving into infrastructure changes, now back to the previous slide, please. Beyond the policy changes, we can think of enhancements to the off-street network, to the network of steps and laneways and paths that might include better brush clearing or lighting or even wayfinding. And it's important that that's a part of people's mental map of how to get around within the neighborhood and in and out of the neighborhood on an everyday basis, because we know when it comes to a crisis response, it can be hard to think about what your alternatives are, but sometimes the best way out is on foot or on a bike, as we've discussed. Enhancements to streets that can include strategic pullouts. In other words, a very short length of widened roadway so that passing vehicles can effectively get past without expanding the entire street width. And possibly improved connections, or improving the network overall by providing more connections, and those can be within the neighborhood or to the town or to the fire roads leading up and over the hills. Next slide, please. I had you going backwards again, sorry, Mindy. So not to belabor it, but the toolbox includes support for other modes of transportation besides driving, management of on-street parking, the creation of those sorts of pullouts, strategic widenings of narrow street sections, and new connections. With this set of tools, we then take a more detailed look at the networks as they currently exist. Next slide, please. So here's a color-coded map of the street network on Christmas Tree Hill that illustrates the street width, essentially. The red lines are streets that are effectively less than 15 feet. You might hear other transportation planners, engineers say curb to curb. Of course, here there aren't curbs in a number of places. Whoops, I just lost the display. There it is. So you see there are a number of very important links to the network. And again, I know you know this from experience, that simply can't accommodate effectively, especially an emergency vehicle coming one way and a private vehicle going the other way. You also see on this slide the streets that do support two-way travel more effectively, the orange-coded ones as 15 to 20 feet, and the buff-colored ones effectively more than 20 feet. The brown-colored links lower down on the map and stretching up over the hills are, of course, the fire roads, and then the greens are paths, off-street paths that in some cases are stairs. So that's the current network, and again, we can identify that there are some places that we probably need to provide a little more width or think about additional links. Next slide, please. And here are some of our ideas. So you see overlaid in blue some locations that could support either strategic widening through those very short distance pullouts, or maybe widening over a longer stretch of street that can support, in the case of A to the right, that's a private driveway that under certain conditions could be improved to support at least emergency vehicle access or private vehicle egress in times of emergency. And then the longer stretches of blue you see down towards the bottom of the screen are specific places where an improvement to the fire road, or maybe even just an improvement to the connection from the neighborhood streets to the fire road, could provide that extra access or egress point that can mean you have 2 or 3 ways to get away from home when the need arises. Next slide, please. Similar information for Chapman Hill. Here, it's the close-up showing specific building locations, and we have Chapman Hill primarily over to the left side of the screen here. Next slide, please. And the network isn't quite as restricted, doesn't have quite as many very tight spots, less than 15 feet in width, as Christmas Tree Hill to the northwest does. But you see there are a few sections that serve a good number of houses that do effectively not allow two-way travel. There's also a much more limited set of off-street paths here in Chapman Hill. So maybe there are opportunities to bring in additional off-street paths. Next slide, please. And here are some of the suggestions. You see again highlighted in blue, places where, at least from a distance perspective, there's not a long segment of either new or improved road necessary to create potential new connections or safer connections because they allow safer two-way travel and connections again to the fire roads and to the surrounding street system. Next slide, please. So how do we evaluate the value to the community, the impacts to the community of those proposed new, both the policy changes and the infrastructure changes? So on the left, this matrix essentially attempts to distill our evaluation. On the left, you see the list of essentially metrics or evaluation criteria, including from the top multimodal access. As we said, that can be valuable in an emergency, but it's also valuable to have options of how to travel day to day and helps us reduce our climate impact and therefore reduce our contribution to the future climate vulnerabilities. And then across the top, you see what aren't necessarily four discrete alternatives, but four general buckets of approaches, status quo being the network that we currently have and the policies that we currently have, and then proceeding to the right, instituting policy changes, such as we discussed about promoting multimodal travel and the uptake of e-bikes, better management of parking, enhanced network here being shorthand for making those tactical smaller changes to the street network, pullouts and other strategic widenings, and the expanded network being increasing the number of connections within and from the network. And you see in general, the ability to provide benefit increases as we talk about the more substantial changes, including new connection points, but so does the cost, and so do the planning needs, and essentially so does the time horizon for when we can institute those, although we know there are vulnerabilities and risks to wildfire and other hazards now that will continue to grow. Next slide, please. So that gets us thinking in terms of how do we do things now that can, again, provide benefits to the community now and can also begin to mitigate some of those risks and set the groundwork for longer term changes as well. I'll highlight here, there's an opportunity, I'm not sure, since I'm not looking at the group chat, if people have feedback or have questions they want to jump into, I'll turn to my colleagues in a moment. But as you think about those various policy and infrastructure options, do think about, well, what might make sense to do in the nearest term, including some enhancements and education and outreach. In the medium term, that might require a little more money, a little more planning, some strategic street widening, an e-bike program, and in the longer term, improvements to fire roads and other connections, and thinking about if and when a fire does come, what are policies around rebuilding? What are policies around what the community would want to have happen after an event like that? So that's it for this section. I'm happy to, I'm not sure if we have some questions teed up. I think we have a poll coming, so.
Well, we have a couple of poll questions I'm going to start with, and so we'll do some polls, and while you're, you can also see if you have any other comments for Chris. So let's start off with this one, which is a check-in. How prepared are the hillside communities and town infrastructure for a wildfire event? What do people think? Are we not prepared, somewhat prepared, prepared, well prepared, or not quite sure? Give you guys a minute of that, and if you're done and you want to put a question out on the chat, feel free to do that as well. And you can also raise your hand if you want to actually say something out loud, and we'll call you out. But you have a couple of 20 more seconds, and okay, we've got about 75% full, so I'm going to go ahead and end this and share everyone's thoughts. And really what people think is that we're somewhat prepared, which I think is right. You know, people have talked a lot about the vegetation management plans and so forth, but But as Chris said, and I'm sure there's other things that we're not quite there yet. So now we have one more question that's a little bit more harder hitting, which is going right to this. This is a lot to read, so I'm going to give you a little extra time here. So there's a number of options here. So we've talked about, Chris just went through some of those adaptation actions regarding hillside transportation, access, especially around wildfire preparation. You can pick up to 3 of these that you think we should be doing. You know, so Chris just went through some of those, everything from e-bikes to on-street parking to educating about evacuation options. And then just a comment as we're answering that from one of ours, since we don't know when a fire will come, it makes sense to start writing post-fire rebuild policies now and not include that into the long-term bucket. So get those policies in while we're still ahead of the game. So thank you, Leslie. All right, I'm gonna give people a little more time because those are so long to read. There's a lot to ask. And it's great, this input is gonna help us as we move forward with making some of those choices, figuring out the cost of this. Let's see, as we're thinking, Barbara has a question, Chris, maybe you can answer this. Are there current requirements for fire mitigation, brush reduction, defensible space? This might be actually for RJ too. What are the enforcement plans for homeowner responsibility compliance? RJ, do you wanna take that on?
Sure, yeah. So we have an active central Marin fire district that goes around and enforces and inspects defensible space. They've done a great job over the last several years, really attacking the dead vegetation and highly, I don't know the exact word we're using these days, but you know, flammable and hazardous. David here is actually probably more of an expert than I am, but yeah, so there's definitely an active program on that front. And sorry, was there a second part of that question?
What are the enforcement plans for homeowner responsibility compliance? Is anybody following up and enforcing those?
Yeah, absolutely. So that does go through Central Marin Fire, and they go around inspecting and writing letters and saying, you know, areas of improvement needed, and they follow up, and they've been very active.
Okay, great.
If I could just
Yes,
allow me to pitch in. This is David Kuhnhart, Vice Mayor. We have had a few instances of, let's say, recalcitrant property owners who haven't taken any time to clear broom and acacia and other very pyrophytic plants. And we've put notice on them and really enforced the removal of those, and a couple of vacant lots and a couple of occupied lots have been significantly abated in this last year. So we have a process and a procedure. If anybody's quite new to this and they would like to see where are the standards and what are we supposed to do, the best place to look is Fire Safe Marin. Fire Safe Marin has published for 10 years some standards of what things should be removed and what things should be saved and planted. And that is a very good source. We're just in the middle of passing a new easing of tree permit standards, which we discussed and passed on first hearing this last meeting on Tuesday. So in 2 weeks more, we'll be in theory, finishing with that to ease up on the how difficult it is to reduce problematic trees that may be overshadowing a particular house.
Thank you, David, and I appreciate that. I'm going to just share the, we just shared on the chat the link for Fire Safe Marin, so folks can also grab that, copy it, and go to that as well. And just in terms of our poll, just a quick snapshot, definitely education is big. But there's also some similar interest in more education about evacuation, looking at pull outs and narrow streets. Oh, sorry, here's the sharing.
Yeah, it sort of highlights to me that there's kind of a suite of responses. Like many of these climate change issues, there isn't a single bullet. It's not like do this one thing and everything's going to be better. It's kind of layering in and creating a suite of alternatives that you can invest in over time or invest in together as a package that will take action to reduce those wildfire risks for the hillside neighborhoods, particularly.
Absolutely, not just one thing. Okay, well, I think we are now going to move down the hill to our coastal challenges and strategies. And Jeremy, are you on and unmuted?
I am indeed.
All right, and it's your show.
Thank you, Mindy. And hello, everybody. So now we're going to move to a discussion about challenges and strategies related to sea level rise and coastal flooding. And actually, the picture we have on the slide at the moment neatly summarizes a key issue that Corte Madera has in this respect: the close proximity of community to the bay in terms of both elevation and distance. So as you can see, finding space to provide protection is going to be a challenge. Next slide, please. Corte Madera is inherently vulnerable to sea level rise, as a considerable proportion of the town is built on historical marshes. This photo, this dates from 1926 and shows early development in the valley, mostly on the drier upland areas. And you can see the railroad marked in red, and also the roads crossing the marshes. They roughly correspond to where 101 is now. And so keep in mind the location of that railroad right away marked in red. Next slide, please. And so in this slide, you can see that the railroad again in red, and you can see that the town has nearly doubled in size, with most of the post-war development in the historical marshes. In some places, levees were constructed to protect low-lying areas from flooding. In other places, fill was placed in the marshes to raise the ground elevation on which houses were built, rather than build new levees. Next slide, please. So this has resulted in a rather garish map of contours, but it has also resulted in significant challenges in several neighborhoods due to initial low elevation, subsequent subsidence, and future sea level rise. So this graphic, as you know, is of Marina Village and Marina Cove. It shows differences in elevation between adjacent neighborhoods. The orange and the red, they're at marsh level. Greens are about 2 to 3 feet above marsh level. So the combination of fill and continuing subsidence has left some areas close to marsh elevation and protected by a levee. And I've circled one of those levees in at the top left-hand corner, and that's about an 8-foot levee or so. And other areas are several feet higher to the east, but with no levee. We need to look for the best opportunities to provide protection and to adapt to sea level rise in these constrained settings. And these issues are not in the future, they are happening now. And so next slide, please. So this photo, I think, actually Adam took this. This photo of Golden Hind Passage by San Clemente Creek shows a king tide in 2015. These extreme tide events are very predictable and occur a few times a year. However, in the future, as sea levels rise, we will see water levels this high much more regularly. And this photo of a king tide taken in 2015, it could be, using current projections, about the regular tide by 2040. Next slide, please. So how would sea level rise impact these neighborhoods? Well, here's a map showing a king tide, 1 foot above regular high tide today. On the area along Golden Hind Passage, you can see a number of houses that are beginning to be affected by flooding, just as we saw in the photo. You can see that Marina Village on the left-hand side on the west, while low-lying, is shaded. That indicates that it wasn't being flooded directly from the bay. And that's because there's a levee in place. Without that levee, flooding from the bay would occur. Next slide, please. If we increase water level by 3 feet, this is about the elevation where things start to get interesting, because that's when things start to overtop on these levees. This is when the levees around Corte Madera would start to be overtopped, and the houses in both Marina Village and Marina Cove could be subject to inundation. You can see a much larger area being inundated. Next slide, please. However, if we zoom out, you can see that these neighborhoods are not alone. With 3 feet of higher water levels and the existing levee elevations, water could extend all the way into the area of town west of 101. This is basically the same as the extent of the historical marshes shown in the first photos. and shows the importance of the existing levees for the protection of the town today. Next slide, please. To provide future flood protection, the elevation of levees will have to be raised. And this table shows some of the assumptions in determining those structure heights. Scientific projections of sea level rise for the bay and guidance for their interpretation are regularly updated by the state's Ocean Protection Council. Recently, they provided an unofficial goal in their strategic plan of ensuring the California coast is resilient to at least 3.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050, a water level we're likely to see later in the part of the century. On top of that, the design elevation for flood protection needs to account for extreme water levels that we would see during storms, where we can have surges of 3 feet or so, waves of 2 feet or so, and also account for freeboard. These elevations could be reduced if we can incorporate natural features such as marshes and beaches in front of the levee to reduce the effects of storms. Next slide, please. Levees protect from surface water. However, as sea level rises, we are also expecting to see groundwater levels rise as salty bay water is pushed inland and under the fresher, shallow groundwater. This can flow under existing levees, impact buried infrastructure such as pipes, interact with contaminated soils, and perhaps result in surface ponding and leading to a reduction in capacity of stormwater channels. Next slide, please. So we have a lot of vulnerabilities, but there are also a lot of different ideas for addressing those, for addressing flooding and for increasing the resilience to sea level rise. Some of those are familiar in the bay, and some are from other parts of the world. And we're looking to find measures that are appropriate to the Corte Madera setting and the Corte Madera conditions over the next century. Next slide, please. Measures tend to be grouped as gray or green measures, and you'll see that those phrases used a lot. And you'll see also more about that in the storyboard. Gray measures are those of the traditional flood protection structures such as levees, seawalls, etc., which will reduce flooding, will have well-established design standards, but have little or no habitat value. Next slide, please. Green measures, on the other hand, use or mimic natural features such as marshes that can reduce storm waves. And in this case, as you can see here, an ecotone slope, a longer slope from the levee that softens and flattens the traditional levee slope. As shown here in these diagrams, there are likely to be, as shown here, there are likely to be many hybrids or combinations of measures, such as combining a traditional levee to keep out the still water elevations and a natural marsh to knock down waves. At Corte Madera, you already have levees and marshes, and future projects could use these in combination to benefit both flood protection and natural habitat. Next slide, please. There may also be other opportunities. Shorebird Marsh is an interesting part of this shoreline. During normal conditions, it functions as a marsh, providing habitat for birds, as its name suggests. However, it also has a tide gate that allows its connection to the bay to be managed. So in storms, extreme water levels are reduced, and Shorebird Marsh acts as a detention basin for stormwater flows from inland. Next slide, please. To reflect the differences in vulnerability and the potential
Jeremy, this is, I think we're stopping for a moment and going to Lucky Drive for RJ's.
Yeah, I was just going to do the outro or whatever you call it, the segue.
Oh, so sorry. Please do.
To reflect the differences in vulnerability and the potential adaptation measures that could be taken on the shoreline, we've divided the Corte Madera shoreline into 4 areas, as already been discussed. These areas each have unique sets of challenges and opportunities. And now RJ will now focus on Paradise Drive and Lucky Drive. Take it away.
Thanks. Thank you, Jeremy. So as mentioned, we're starting to group the various study areas into areas with, common, goals, priorities, opportunities. And so when we look at Lucky Drive and Paradise Drive, what's common about them is we see roads that serve the region. So on Lucky Drive, as you know, it's one of the main arteries into central Marin, Larkspur, Ross, Fairfax, and others. You've got Paradise Drive on the other side. It also serves unincorporated Marin and Tiburon. And so that being a regional benefit. In addition, those two projects we believe are on a relative scale easier to implement due to the lesser impacts and permitting challenges for, with respect to environmental compliance. And then both also share, next slide, please. Both also have opportunities for various transportation improvements, and we'll go through each one of those. So here at Lucky Drive, this one is currently inundated on an annual basis. This photo was taken in December 2019. At the time, it was approximately 18 inches of water backed up there. So before long, it's could be unpassable in that same event. And so that's one that we'd like to prioritize and really try to compete for any regional grant funds or any grant funds really as based on a regional basis, and try to build something in the near term, and we believe we can implement something within 5 years should we get funding for this. Next slide, please. Here's a overhead view of that same zone. You can see where that picture was taken. There's jurisdictions on both sides in Larkspur and County of Marin, and then as you can see where Highway 101 is. So there's opportunities to partner and collaborate, and we'll be reaching out to those agencies soon to see their level of interest. But we want to keep that road open as much as possible and really kind of get in front of it before it becomes impassable on a frequent basis. Next slide, please. And here's just one of two concepts to date that just shows some of the potential transportation improvements that could also be implemented as part of a project that would raise the road. This one showing a buffered class 2. It would remove some parking that's not heavily used other than for those using Redwood High School, but also there's a separate strategy that would be a class 4 bike lane that would be on the west side of that street. So those would be discussed as part of that project planning and design.
Can I stop you there and
Yes.
ask, Jack had a question about what inundation actually means. The foundation
Sure.
at monthly high tides or water entering over the homes?
So on this one, it's we have some storm drain pipes in there that are creating kind of a bathtub filling effect, as well as I believe there's also some surface flow overtopping coming through the apartment complexes immediate to the northwest.
Mm-hmm. And those buildings, sorry, RJ.
Yeah, and that would need to be studied further. At this point, it's just observational at this point.
And those maps are based on the most recent LiDAR that was flown by the county and processed in 2019, and they're just elevation data based on the bare earth. They don't take into account the actual building elevations at this point.
Next slide, please. Great. Now moving over to Paradise Drive. So this particular section of roadway, it does not have the same severity of overtopping. We do see some minor water on the roadway, but I think that's more of a result of minor slopes and ponding. But soon, based on the elevations we're seeing, that could be a road that's at risk. And given the opportunities for transportation improvements, given the roadway is degraded, it makes sense to consider sea level, raising the road at the time of those improvements that are actually needed at this time. And so we do have some funding through TAM to do some of those transportation improvements, and what we'd likely try to move that design forward using those grant funds and position ourselves to further that design and put us in a position to apply for construction funds and other things in the near term. Next slide. Here's just a zoomed in view of some of the multimodal improvements. There's two private schools, as many of you know. We're looking at improvements to pet access, accessibility, safety when we're talking about how to cross the street there, and then also bike improvements as well. Next slide.
All right, I think we're back to you, Jeremy.
Thanks, RJ. So now we'll turn our attention to the area between Corte Madera Creek and San Clemente Creek, the Corte Madera Marsh. And here we're talking about sort of midterm type of projects. RJ was talking about near term, things you can do now. So these are midterm. So these are much more arm wavy, and it'd be great to get your input on the direction that these are going in. The town has no actual direct interest in the marsh. However, it is adjacent to the town. And as sea levels rise, the marsh and along with the rest of the bay will start advancing towards the town. So it's something to pay attention to. Next slide. The railroad right-of-way, which is the dotted white line in the map, separates the Corte Madera Marsh from the shopping malls and the economic core of Corte Madera. In some places, the existing berm provides some flood protection, and in the future could be an important alignment for flood protection as sea levels rise. Today, it provides public access to the bay. In the future, it is planned to be the route of smart rail extension from San Rafael to the village. The railroad right-of-way runs behind a mosaic of existing high-quality marsh, much of which is managed by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And there are also areas with the potential for the restoration of more marsh, such as the area managed by the Golden Gate Bridge District. There may therefore be opportunities to realize co-benefits and share costs of improving flood protection, improving habitat, as well as accommodating public trails and transit, all to the benefit of Corte Madera. Next slide, please. And I know Barbara's on the phone, so I was highlighting her project at Madeira Bay Park as one of the recent projects to start to reshape this shoreline, along with a new one from the Bridge District, which is going to be breaking ground soon on the restoration of 4 acres on their parcel. Next slide. But whilst the town of Corte Madera is not responsible for the marshes, there are projects in the marsh that could be integrated with any flood protection levee that is built to protect the town. In the past, dredge sediment fill was placed on the marsh, which today represents an opportunity to excavate down to restore marsh and to use that excavated soil to increase the level of flood protection and create levees and ecotone slopes, as we discussed earlier, along the railroad right-of-way. Fostering collaboration with other stakeholders could realize some of these benefits. And as part of this project, we've been having exploratory talks with a number of the stakeholders, including the Bridge District and Fish and Wildlife. Next slide, please. A levee along this area could take various forms with different degrees of separation between the flood protection levee, marsh, trail, and the railroad. And Nelson Nygaard, the transportation engineers, have been put into thinking about how to integrate road, rail, people, and habitat in these types of cross sections. So here are some of the ideas for that collaboration between stakeholders that could influence the levee design in this area. The 2 cross sections at the top incorporate the proposed smart line extension to the mall with varying degrees of public access. All of these cross sections include some form of ecotone slope to connect the levees to a restored marsh, to provide transitional habitat and to protect the levees from waves. South of the smart extension, the arrangement is simplified by not having to consider the railroad, but it also runs adjacent to a very high quality marsh and looking for a smaller ecotone slope in those areas to stop filling a good quality marsh areas. Based on the potential for multiple benefits and potential conflicts, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the different ideas for the railroad right-of-way and the marsh. Next slide.
Okay, so folks, this is a moment here just to we want to take a pause because I know we are providing a lot of information and it can be slightly overwhelming. And I know there has been some good chats going on. Does anybody want to raise or talk about something right now out loud? Let's see, I'm going to start here, Leslie. We did a virtual reality sea level rise viewer on the multi-use path by Tamalpais High School in Mill Valley. This would be a great way to help the community envision the coming sea level rise issues and potential solutions. Horizontal levees, hardscape levees, etc. Leslie, that would be great. And maybe you can share that with us after here. That would be fantastic. RJ or Sasha, just looking at the chats you've seen, are there any other questions or things you want to bring up that you've been hearing from folks?
Yeah, so there are a couple questions and I've responded to them, but yeah, there would be considerations from agencies such as Sanitary District 2, Marina Municipal, other utility agencies, where if a road was raised, there would be a decision point whether they want to raise it as well. And I think a lot of that would depend on the age of their current infrastructure. You know, they might wait for that particular appurtenance to kind of expend its life before they raise it. You know, if you have a facility that's good for 15 more years, you may just kind of wait it out for 5 or 10 before you actually spend the cost and reconstruct it at a higher elevation. But certainly the added depth, the potential for groundwater, the potential for salinity water, all increases the cost to maintain, potential for corrosion, and a number of other things. Seeing here, yeah, and there was a question about you know, bike levees versus roadway levees, and I think, you know, the trade-off would be when you raise a road, we're working within the town right away in most cases, so wouldn't have to acquire private real estate. Perhaps the bike lane could also be within that right away. Hard to say, it depends on the specific zone. And then separately, as tide rises, if you raise the road and that's the thing you're trying to preserve or maintain, you don't have the same risk of groundwater intrusion that could come through a bike path levee.
Could I ask a question of Jeremy, please?
Sure, go ahead, David.
Jeremy, can you go back to your kind of keystone slide, which shows the matrix of the different, if this rise, then that levee? It's mostly numbers, and there's a highlighted portion, and I'm not sure that you've given quite enough time and weight to the objective realities in that slide.
That was a while ago, was it, David?
Yes, yeah, it's several back.
Okay, let me zoom back there. I think I know what you're talking about here.
It's a matrix with numbers
Right.
that if with this there, yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
That's it.
so go on, please.
Well, I just, first of all, if you could define feet above what exactly, what is this mean high tide today? What is the benchmark, and what does it mean? The one number that, let's say, if sea level rise on the far left, if sea level rises by 3.5 feet, then you go across 15 foot what? 15-foot levee is needed above what exactly?
So all these dimensions are relative to NAVD 88, which is a common datum used in the bay. So you're measuring an elevation above a common datum, and so that says about 0 is about mean low water. It just happens to be that that's not how it's set. We have about a mean high water is about 9 foot or so. Sorry, about 6 foot. Sea level rise of 3 foot. Storm surges are about 3 foot. Waves are about 2 foot. Freeboards about 2 foot. So you can start adding up these pieces to say how high does the wall need to be, or the crest of the elevation need to be, to stop the water coming in. That's basically what we're doing.
So if I can clarify, so these are elevations. So for instance, if a common king tide is 6.5, well, we'll just use a round number, 7 feet. Let's just say a more extreme king tide. The box that's circled would say that, you know, to accommodate the mean high water, sea level rise, 100-year storm plus 2 feet freeboard, which shows 15-foot elevation, you would need to raise 8 feet of protection.
And then RJ, sorry, the current like levees out there around Marina Village are in the 8 to 9 feet range, right? So this would be
I would
6.
say, yeah, Marina Village is, from my knowledge, closer to 9.
Mm-hmm. So it'd be 6 feet above the current levee high elevation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's pretty. That's a lot of something. and it's a lot of expense. And I just wanted to, is there agreement on what we're solving for, or what we think we need to solve for in the medium term here within our budgetable capital improvement program?
This seems, David, like an excellent segue into the second part of Jeremy's conversation, actually. Did you look ahead? Did we give you the slides?
Well, to touch on costs, Councilmember Kuhnhart, we do intend to start to develop some of those costs. This is a planning effort. The numbers we're going to probably work on as we come back to you, hopefully in the fall. They're probably going to be more comparing projects within the Bay Area, seeing what they're paying for these types of improvements, and just kind of extrapolating them over. They aren't going to be, engineer estimate level at this point, but it will at least get us a sense of how to prioritize each of these strategies. And obviously, as we move forward, then we would enter into a deeper analysis where we get, much better costs.
And the only other thing that I would just raise as a big picture thought, we're going to need to look at not just, let's say, a bikeway, but other potential uses, and probably not just railroad, but other potential uses that could directly benefit from such an expensive raising, if you will. And so I think we need to open our minds to the other beneficiaries and other potential sources of funding for this rather gargantuan program.
And I'll just say, as we move on, like that, I think, David, these are in the story map / survey that people were continuing to have links to and will be on our webpage. There's a place for comments on there and to think about that. This is really that chance to sort of start weighing some of those trade-offs that you're talking about. So thanks for bringing that up. And maybe Jeremy answer some of the questions and some of the ideas that he's looking at in this next section on Marina Village.
If we could spend one more minute, I'd like to go to the Marsh cross sections showing kind of the ecotone slopes, the bike levee versus, and maybe I missed the mark when Jack had his question in the chat. I was kind of thinking in the frame of reference of Paradise Drive. I kind of wasn't quite thinking about this one. And so, there are, we have started to look at this. This will probably be something that we continue a dialogue on. Likely, I think this is a good one to bring to our flood control board. But there are some challenges. On one hand, if you, let's see, you've got several alternatives, but the first one, 2.1, we're seeing the train tracks staying down, and therefore you've got this levee that is higher elevation and you don't have to build it to accommodate a train. So that's, a cost benefit. Whereas you have this one, the next one down, and you're raising the whole thing. And there's sections where SMART has said they potentially one day in the future could go to the malls. We want to have a conversation with them about how realistic that is and if they're willing to loosen that stance. But building a levee that can withstand the weight of a train obviously has its own cost implications. So in the section where we don't believe SMART has an interest of going further south, say further south between the Marsh along San Clemente Drive, I think there would be a cost savings in, or it would make sense, at least based on what we know today, to go with a levee that is separate of that, or that doesn't have to be designed to withstand a train and be elevated.
Could I say something?
Go ahead, Barbara.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say in regard to funding, there is, I don't know what Councilman Kuhnhart was really referring to in terms of the other benefits, but there is a funding source that we've all voted for, most of us, with the Restoration Authority, that if this could be made a major restoration project along with a sea level rise adaptation for the community, that's a potential funding source because we have money from that to do this in San Rafael. So certainly it could be something that Corte Madera should consider.
RJ,
Thank you, Barbara.
I heard previously talk about the levees being heavy and subsiding over time in the bay mud that that area is built upon. Is that not a factor?
Yeah, settlement is a factor, but it's depending on what's on top of it, can factor in the level of risk at which you are willing to add that weight. Obviously, we try to mitigate that by using lighter weight materials where possible and things like that. But you know, if it means that you're committing to having to do some maintenance, topping off every so many years or decades, and you understand those challenges, it might still be worth it.
Could I also ask about the 3.5 foot level by 2050 that was basically pulled out of the clear blue sky by the Natural Resources Agency staff? Will you be looking at various, even when you're talking about a levee, will you be looking at incremental alternatives of height that could be, you know, added to later to sort of reduce the initial costs? Or are you going to look at something that will be good for the next 100 years?
No, you hit on it, and you're going to see that here shortly on the next chapter that we'll get into.
Okay.
All right, let's go for it. Are you ready, Jeremy?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. All right. On.
Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to the southern part of the shoreline, where we have the communities of Marina Cove and Marina Village. So next slide. We've already seen the potential flooding in these areas, and now we'd like to explore with you some ideas for different alignments of levees and tie gates for providing protection in these areas. What makes these communities attractive is their proximity to the bay and to the marsh habitat. But this very proximity also makes it difficult to find space for these structures. So we've developed a couple of alignments which serve as bookends from which hybrids could be developed, and which elements which discussed earlier about ecotone slopes and beaches could be incorporated. You might also want to think, as David pointed out, thinking about firstly about a collaborative approach, looking at different ways that part of it could be funded by restoration and part by flood risk management. And you could also think about it in terms of phasing or an adaptation pathways. We know what the final numbers are going to be, but we could respond incrementally over time. So next slide, please. This slide shows an inner alignment where a levee or sheet pile wall might be constructed around the communities. This is to keep the water out. Where there is more space between the houses and the water, such as by Marina Village, marked by the letter A, there are opportunities to build an ecotone slope, so putting a transition into the adjacent marsh. However, along the southern side of the San Clemente Creek, marked with the letter C, there is very little space between the backyards and the channel for a levee, or more likely a sheet pile wall in this area. A tide gate on San Clemente Creek, marked by the letter B, could be constructed, which would allow you to shorten the length of wall or levee that would be needed to protect those homes along San Clemente Creek. And this tide gate, it could be operated in a similar manner to Shorebird Marsh to provide habitat and also to serve as a stormwater detention basin. However, the disadvantage is that the existing habitat with San Clemente Creek could be impacted due to increased inundation by water. On the edge of the bay, letter D, at the mouth of San Clemente Creek, this area is exposed to waves, and there may be opportunities to place a coarse beach of sand or gravel to reduce wave action that could cause erosion of the wall and overtopping. So we're changing the type of habitat to depending on the type of environment, moving from marsh towards a beach. Next slide. So now we're going to zoom in on Marina Village. where we have more space, and where we've just drawn a conceptual cross-section to illustrate what this might look like. Next slide, please. This shows the existing levee and dike baylands from the houses across the dike baylands to the existing levee and muzzy marsh. Next slide. This shows a raised levee and an ecotone slope, long slope in front of the levee, which could provide habitat value to the marsh without impacting the marsh itself, while improving flood protection of the community. Remember, this is conceptual. We haven't located the levee. This could be moving around, but this is to get the general idea that using some of the land in between the marsh and the houses could be put to better use, or a different use. Next slide, please. Closer to the bay along Golden Hind Passage, well, there's a lot less space between the houses and the water. Next slide, please. So here is the existing cross-section. The houses and the yards are right on the edge. Here, the levee or sheep pile wall would have to be as narrow as possible to fit in the available space. Next slide. You've got to keep the still water level out. However, there may be opportunities to create a coarse beach in front of that wall, which would knock down the waves, reducing erosion and overtopping. And as that table we had at the beginning, one of the elements in there was the size of the waves and the amount of overtopping. That would reduce the requirement for the height of the wall if we could knock down the waves before they reach the wall to make a slower structure and a cheaper structure. Next slide, please. However, there are other alternatives, and this is the other bookend, an outer alignment. That could have less impact directly on the houses along San Clemente Creek. To gain space, this would mean placing a narrow levee or sheep pile wall on the northern side of San Clemente Creek, letter A, directly adjacent to Martha's Marsh, and moving the tide gate to the mouth of the creek, letter B. This would minimize the length of wall immediately adjacent to backyards. An ecotone slope would require placing considerable amounts of fill on the existing marsh in Martha's Marsh. So that would not necessarily be acceptable. However, we could reduce the volume of fill and provide similar types of functions by placing marsh mounds, that's the letter C, in Martha's Marsh to provide high tide refugia and provide some resilience to sea level rise, even though we're not building an ecotone slope because of its proximity to the wall. And this could provide some of the same habitat functions as that ecotone slope. Next slide, please. To summarize, as with all alternatives, there are trade-offs. And some of those, and this is what we'd like to have, it's this 4-week period of discussion about the different trade-offs. What does the community value and how would they see these pieces and what are they prepared to pay for? An inner alignment would require building closer to people's homes at the edge of the neighborhood in Marina Cove, while the outer alignment would leave more space. The inner alignment would also have less stormwater detention capacity than the outer alignment. If we have the stormwater master plan, perhaps that would indicate how much value that would provide. However, the inner alignment is also likely to have fewer ecological impacts than the outer alignment because less of San Clemente Creek would be separated from the bay, and there would be no construction in Martha's Marsh. Based on these bookend alternatives and the different trade-offs, we'd like to hear from you what approaches make more sense for Corte Madera. Of course, there are other alternatives here of not protecting those areas, but these are the discussions that would be also great to hear about the general approach to defense in this area.
Yeah, if I could jump in real quick, you know, and I'm seeing the chat and I think there's some good points. You know, definitely we're looking at what could be built, and that's where we're talking about the inner alignment, the outer alignment. You know, we also have to consider what does do nothing look like, and also what does a more, you know, another strategy, is there another alignment to be considered? So those are all on the table. I don't want to solely focus it on the inner and outer, but we do want to get your thoughts on that, those two.
So to that point, I've just launched a poll here, and I know that you guys have a lot of different ideas that may not be a very short list here. So go ahead and add those in the chat. And then again on the story map, you'll be able to do even more there. But please, let's just get our initial sort of pulse on these ideas that were just presented by Jeremy. We'll give folks some time to sort of think about this.
I seem to have lost it. Could you send it to me again?
I don't know if I can, Barbara. Look on your screen. It might be a little button or something. Unfortunately, I have a different screen than others.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't.
Barbara, you'll see the results in a second, and if you want to cast a vote, you can put it in the chat, and we'll include it.
Okay.
Absolutely. And again, these questions are going to be in the survey and the story map. So when you'll have more time to sort of think about this, this is more a good time for us to just have a little pulse. All right, I'm going to give us just another 20 seconds or so for people to put their ideas in there. Okay, looks like folks are finished doing what they're going to do. And hold on, and I will. Hello. All right. So it seems like in this small little test case, the outer alignment had the greater pulse, and nobody thinks we should be doing nothing, RJ. So you have job security. You have more work to do. So there you go. We have definitely some people who don't know, and I'm sure there was a number of you who did not answer, and these are some big questions. So again, we'll be talking more about this. So let's see, we can continue on here and go to our long-term adaptation. So RJ, this is you. Actually,
All right. Yeah, I'm on.
Yeah, before you start here, RJ, maybe Jack had another question. Is there a limit on the creek, this sea level rise height that a floodgate can accommodate? So that might be for you, Jeremy.
So my understanding is the levees along the berm along the San Clemente Creek is about 9 foot. So you have to close the gate at 9 foot. Otherwise you get flooding in there. As far as how much sea level rise, the higher you have it, say you decide to close at 12 feet or something like that, you've got to build the levees obviously around it to that elevation, but also it will close more frequently. And so at some point, even though you're raising it up, you've got to make sure it's closed at 9 foot, and that elevation, you can figure out by the end of the century, you might be closing it every couple of weeks, or then every week, and then almost every tide. So that's the long term, as we talked before about phasing and about thinking ahead. This is, all these sea level rise projects are interim projects because sea level rise is going to continue, and that's what RJ I think is going to address that longer term adaptation.
Great, perfect segue. All right,
Yep.
RJ.
Well, I'd love to sit here and say we've got all the answers, but this is a monster of a challenge. We're obviously committed to continuing to really study it and do everything we possibly can. A lot of these options, when we look at them in a vacuum, what's best, inner alignment, outer alignment, and it's fun to kind of cast a vote on a poll, but we haven't yet folded in costs. If we put all the money on that one area, but then we neglect the other side of town, well, the whole thing as a whole doesn't work. So it's really going to be an iterative process. It's going to be, constantly updating the science and design and data, and really coming up with an overall priority plan. This climate adaptation plan in general is designed to kind of be we are going to adopt something is the goal, but it will be something that's going to be kind of a living document that needs to be updated over time. And we're also, as we talk about phase approach, we're going to look at, what are the options for, say, Marina Village, Mariner Cove, to better protect them for, pick a number, 20, 30 years, and what does that cost? And then you start doing that kind of cost benefit ratio. So more to come. We're going to try to fold in some costs on the next one. We're not going to have exact numbers, but it's going to just further the overall discussion of things. And talking on this slide as well, when we talk near term, medium term, long term, that doesn't mean that if something's in the medium or long term category that we're just gonna punt it for 10 or 20 years. It just means it's gonna be more difficult to implement. So for instance, on the near term, we might have some that we could put a grant application in for design funds and feel comfortable that we could deliver it in 5 years. Whereas the medium terms, we might be putting in a planning or an application for environmental, to do a planning and environmental type scope to, to get that first stepping stone, which then puts us in position for that next step. So, a lot to consider, a lot more to discuss. And we love all your feedback, and we're planning to, like I said, come back to you in a few months.
Yeah, and I just want to say, Ann Thomas just had a good question. And I think this is something we're going to be evaluating, which is not only at the cost of various alternatives to consideration, but it's also who will be paying those costs. So I think that's something that is definitely going to have to be discussed and further considered, right, RJ?
Yeah, and that's, obviously there's areas that, are more town focused. And then we've also touched on these regional areas where we're going to rely on that partnership and collaboration. And so those are all going to come into the equation. And, we're just going to keep plugging away, improving the information, having those conversations, and just further sharpen our pencils on how best to tackle this huge challenge in front of us. But I know I'm excited about it. I know our team's excited about it, and we're up for the challenge. And so we're gonna keep going.
So I'm going to wrap up so people who need to get off to dinner can, and then if people need to have a couple more questions, we're here to stay if you need it. So just to sort of wrap up tonight, really appreciate everyone spending this time and digging in. There's a ton of information. It's a little overwhelming. It means a lot. And so what we are offering is that on the project website, you can just go to that, and there's a banner that leads to the survey and the story map that, again, will give you this information. You can go through it, really spend some time and go and learn about that. But then you can also give us some feedback. There's some different surveys on that. So hopefully, please do that. Share that with folks. Share that with other people you know. We would love to have more the merrier on that. Next step, we're going to be taking all of this feedback. We're going to have all these ideas open till about mid-July. We're going to be integrating that into the next set of solutions. You'll be seeing us again as another workshop. Maybe we could even do it in person, we all hope, I'm sure. But if not, we'll do this again. And we'll hopefully get some sort of a draft in the fall of 2020. So I think for those who want to sign off, go ahead. The team here with the town and all of the consultants are going to stay on. So if you have some more questions, and I know Susie, you had one here, which might be something we can start off with. But for those who want to leave, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
I have to leave, and I couldn't respond to the person, that asked about whether we bought the property along the marsh. And yes, we did, and we did a restoration project there 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay, great.
Audubon
did.
Awesome. Thank you, Barbara.
I have to leave.
Good night. Thank you for joining us.
Good night, Barbara. And Mindy, I just want to, if people need, I just want to say thank you for participating. It really does, take to figure out this path together and to co-design these solutions. So we appreciate you being here and for sharing, the opportunity to comment with your friends, neighbors, and resource groups and contacts as we move forward.
Great. So I do have a quick question, or maybe not quick, it's probably a comment by Susie, is do we all need to raise our houses in Marina Cove? You're working on the infrastructure around us. And this has been a conversation we've had a little bit about what does that mean about raising houses Marina Cove. RJ, do you want to start this and maybe others can join in?
Sure. I don't know if it's easy to go back to the just existing elevation map we have.
I'm going to, I will do that. Hold on a second. I'm going to switch out of my view here so I can get back here.
So currently there are several triggers that would require you to raise a house, and kind of the most notable are the Substantial improvements, if you spend more than 50% of the structure value on a home, you'd be required to raise your base flood elevation to base flood elevation plus 1, which is 11 feet. So if you go to the one, perhaps Minnie, with the more red and orange colors.
Oh, okay, that one.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. So that would be a requirement, as part of that. So here you can see, your lower level of your house would need to be at 11 feet. This is reflecting the ground around it. So that's currently in place. There are several areas that do have surface flow due to tides, and there are, I'm sure anyone who's been out there on a king tide, I mean, I've seen some lakes out there, and so raising a house, it does protect your home. It doesn't necessarily protect your ability to get to your home or out of your home in all instances, especially if you're used to using a vehicle. So that would be another challenge. So tons of challenges. It's kind of, we just have to pick one set of strategies and try to build out from there. But right now we're still just analyzing the best path forward.
Need more
I don't know if
kayaks.
Yeah.
Let's see, anybody else have a question they want to raise? And we can obviously jump around to the different slides and move to this screen so it's easier. Anything, I mean, we obviously can all say goodnight to each other and start absorbing this, but want to make sure there's time if anybody has another question or thought they want to share. All right, it does sound like folks are ready to end our evening. So
Could I just ask quickly, how many at the peak, how many participants were there? And is there any way to notice how many were actively participating in this East Side planning effort?
We had 49 at the top, which was great, I think. I cannot tell you how many people were actively doing that. I mean, we have people in the chat, and then all the polls are anonymous, but most of the polls we had from 35, around 35 people answering those. So that gives you a sense of people who are actively and able to do. Some people had a problem with the poll, but most people had a chance to.
I'm just going to personally predict that there's probably a lot of folks who will hear about this and will start to get engaged after this, and there will be more need for communication, but perhaps a revisit of this, that's all.
Yes, and we are recording tonight, so the video, it takes a couple days for them to process it for us, but we'll have the video of this workshop online next week, probably on Monday. So they'll be able to watch the video, they'll be able to see the PowerPoint, and then interact on the story map. And the story map is very interactive, so you can zoom in on the different sea level rise maps, on the hillside maps, and then also answer survey questions. So that's a pretty good tool for people to really dig in a little bit more.
And that's just all available on the Corte Madera adapts.org website. Right on the front page, you can link to that more detailed survey map.
Yep, and the PowerPoint to David will be provided. You can get that on the Corte Madera Adapts website, David.
As I said in the chat, excellent job from the city staff and the consultants. I'm just really blown away by how much you've done and how much it lays out a path for others to follow. Really good.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you, Jack. Appreciate it. I see a question from Sachi mentioning FEMA HMGP funding. I'll be honest, I wasn't completely familiar with it. I did just now kind of take a look, and it sounds like, and maybe if you're more familiar, you can enlighten me. That's funding available for post a disaster. And from my experience with FEMA, oftentimes they would not consider something that is predictable and known as a disaster. They're more often jumping into the, say, wildfire, COVID, or heavy rainfall that was not expected type events.
RJ,
and, yes,
I just want to interrupt on that because that has been the way that FEMA has been working up till the past few years. We actually got we at the county, working with a fire district, got a grant for what they call pre-mitigation, or some bureaucratic term that is really to avoiding the very, very costly damage that has been happening. So they're getting smarter, and there is money available. It's not nearly as much as to fix the problem once it's actually happened, but they're getting the idea that stitch in time saves a dime and all that stuff.
Well, that's great to hear, and it sounds like I got to do some more homework on that. But thank you, Sachi, for bringing that to my attention, and Jack for furthering on the discussion.
All right. Well, with that, with hopeful sign that FEMA's moving to help us out, I think it's a good night. And RJ, I don't know if you want to have any final words, but otherwise, please keep on participating and sharing with everybody else.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And like I said, we're opening the feedback window. Keep bringing the comments. The deadline is just to kind of help us reach a point where we can grab it all and kind of start processing it. We'll try to take feedback at any time, but yeah, to the extent possible, July 17th would be great to kind of keep this productive for the whole CAP team. Thank you.
And Mindy, just before we sign off, will you put the last slide up with our contact emails? You can send us emails there, and through the website, there's a contact section too. And those emails, like if you have more to share, then you can put in the survey. Feel free to send it to us that way.
I just see one typo on my email. Just for those that are noting, SUO, just in case.
Thanks for fixing that, RJ.
Yep.
Instant. There you go. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening. Enjoy your dinner and your evening. Appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.